Okay, looks like we're live. We want to welcome everybody to Spring Conference. We want to welcome, we don't have quite 70 people here yet. We have 70 registered live, so we are super excited for those of you that have joined us in person. We have been looking forward to this for a year. Justice Himonas and I were talking yesterday. This is his first presentation in 14 months, so he's excited to see some bodies here. We want to welcome the 200 plus pajama-clad people that are at home. Last year after Spring Conference, the evaluations were, we love being able to watch it at home so we can lay in our hammock, be in our pajamas, whatever, but we miss the in-person. And so hopefully next year the room will be full. We are recording, and we will be posting the sessions later on our webpage at upc.utah.gov. Appreciate Bill Francis from the Imagination Company for being here and once again providing the live feed and recording for us. Y'all should have received an email yesterday from me. I'll send it out again. The SWAT board is accepting nominations for a position on their board for a juvenile prosecutor. So if you would like to serve or want to nominate somebody to serve, if you will email Ryan Robinson. Ryan is the SWAP president. He will accept the nominations, and then tomorrow when we break for lunch, I'll post up those who have been nominated, and you'll be voting by text. You'll send either Marilyn or myself a text to vote for that person, so look for that tomorrow. As previously published, so this should not be news or a shock to anybody. There was no Wi-Fi at this conference. We come to these conferences and just assume that Wi-Fi is provided. I don't know how many of you know, last year during the legislative session, UPC was actually on the cutting block. It was suggested that UPC didn't have a role and that you all could get your CLEs elsewhere. Thankfully, we survived that, but like every other agency in the state, because of COVID, we did take a hit to our budget. Tried to get that money back this year. We're not successful in doing so, so we're still operating at about $28,000 below our normal budget. Because of that, we could not provide Wi-Fi. It's several $1,000s here at the Sheraton. So hopefully you have all downloaded your materials ahead of time. If not, I would suggest you find your neighbor or use your hotspot. And so we apologize for the inconvenience. Hopefully next year we will be back up at full budget, full speed. So like I said, hopefully it's not a surprise to anybody. Your course evaluation, we've got to talk about that for a couple minutes. When you get access to the internet, remember it is all done online. So you go to our webpage at upc.utah.gov, click on the members tab, and it will bring you down to the evaluations. Click on that, it should take you, or look for Spring Conference, click on the select, and you'll go through and do the course evaluation. If you're using a hotspot, we'd encourage you to do your evaluation as the conference moves along. If you wait to do it later, that's fine as well. There are we've got a submit button and we've got a save button. If you are doing your evaluation as the conference proceeds, don't hit submit until you're ready to hit submit. Just instead save your progress. You will not be able to complete your evaluation unless you actually have registered and Marilyn has received a check. So if the proverbial check is still in the mail from your office and you try to go in and get online and do the registration, you will not be able to do that. So just check with Marilyn. She can see what the status is. We will close the evaluation page and send in the CLE report by June 15th. So that is your deadline to get your evaluation done for this conference. If you wait longer than that, you're going to have to beg, plead, and bribe Marilyn to get your report or to get the evaluation submitted. So speaking of course evaluations, do not, I repeat, do not, did I mention, do not wait for almost 2 years and facing suspension of your bar license to submit CLE. That happened just in the last couple of months. We had somebody that didn't submit their CLE and we had to go back and open up evaluations for that person over the last 2 years and to make some special considerations. So please do not wait for almost 2 years to submit your course evaluation. For prosecutors, there is an additional survey. If you have been attending conferences last year or so, you will have noticed that we have included this. By statute now, as part of our budgetary process, we have to report certain performance measurements to CCJJ. And so we have 3 areas that we have to report. One of the questions is, what percentage of your CLE comes solely from UPC conferences? If we're not going to be training on any trauma or domestic violence at this conference, but those conferences that we do, you'll see questions as a result of this domestic violence training. Will you proceed to trial without the participation of the victim? As a result of trauma-informed training, will you use a trauma-informed expert at trial? So just be aware that we have to ask those questions. If you have any questions about your CLE, about registration, other materials, that's our contact information. Hopefully you all have been in contact with one of us over the couple of years, but that's who you can contact. Any questions on the announcements? Restrooms are just down the hall for those of you that are first timers here at the Sheraton, and I know we've got a couple of brand new prosecutors here. It was nice to meet you that have just a couple of months, so welcome. Restrooms are down here. A question was asked, do you have to pay for parking in the hotel parking lot? That's new since the last time we were here, and the answer is no. You're here as part of the conference. So I think that's about it. Any other questions? Okay, let me switch over to Justice Himonas' presentation. Just a second. So last year, you remember that we talked quite a bit about bias at our conferences. In fact, we got a couple of comments after the fact that, gosh, I left a UPC conference and I felt beat up, that have all these inherent biases and that we're these really awful people. That's not the message that we wanted to send, and we hope that you realize that wasn't the message. What the message was is that we are great and that we can do better. And so we had invited Justice Simonis to present last spring at conference about gender bias in the courtroom and what his observations are from the bench, from his legal career. I'm going to pose this question right up front, and I'll let Justice Simonis address it, is why have a man come in and talk to us about gender bias in the courtroom? That's a really great question, and it's a question that the training committee asked themselves, and yet they still decided that we wanted to hear from Justice Simonis. We felt that he had some great perspective from the bench, from experience, and he is going to talk to you about that. We're also left over from last year is Professor Bauman is speaking after Justice Himonas, talking about race and prejudice among prosecutors. She published a study a couple years ago. It's going to show us that we do a good job. So that's my blurb is don't feel like we're still beating up on you guys, about bias and whatnot. We're here delivering a positive message. So let me briefly introduce Justice Himonas. Justice Konstantinos Himonas is a justice of the Utah Supreme Court. Prior to his appointment to the Utah High Court, he served as a trial court judge for many years. Justice Himonas earned his BA in economics from the University of Utah and a JD from the University of Chicago. Upon graduating law school, he returned to Utah and spent 15 years working as a litigator, focusing on complex civil litigation. Justice Himonas has served as the chairperson of the litigation section of the Utah State Bar, the co-chair of the 3rd District Court's Pro Bono Committee, the co-chair of the Supreme Court's Working Group and Task Force for Regulatory Reform, and a member of the Judicial Conduct Commission. He currently serves on the Utah Judicial Council as the chair of the Supreme Court's Committee for Licensed Legal Practitioners and the chair of the Judicial Council's Task Force on Online Dispute Resolutions. He is also active in a number of national and international groups concerned with the administration of justice. Justice Himonas is deeply involved in access to justice issues. He publishes and can often be found speaking to local, national, and international audiences on the topic. At present, he is deeply involved in efforts to reimagine the regulations of the practice of law in order to make it more affordable and more accessible to all. Justice Himonas is taught as an adjunct professor at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law and guest lectured at numerous law schools, including in Kiev, Ukraine, through the Levitt Institute for International Development. He's been honored by the S.J. Quinney College of Law as an honorary alumnus of the year. He is a recipient of the Rebuilding Justice Award from the Institute for the Advancement of the American Legal System and the Judicial Excellence Award from the Utah State Bar. And he is a fellow of the National Conference of Technology and Dispute Resolution and a life fellow of the American Bar Association. Most recently, the American Bar Association has honored Justice Simonis as a legal rebel. And with that, we will turn the time over to Justice Deno Himonas.
I am so happy to be here. Thank you. It's been 14 months, lots of presentations, Bob, in those 14 months. First one live, and it is invigorating. Listen, I want to start off by inviting questions throughout the presentation. And I do this for each of my presentations. I don't want you to feel like you need to wait until the end. I want to hear from you as we roll tape on this. I also want to address two items. One is the one that Bob mentioned at the outset, and that is, what in the heck is a man doing up here talking to us about gender bias in the courtroom? Yeah, that's a great question, right? And honestly, when invited, one of the things I did was turn around and talk to a couple of my female colleagues. So, law professor at the University of Utah, another participant, said, is this really appropriate? Is this what we should be doing? And the answer I got was unambiguously yes, that we need both. Let's be clear. It shouldn't be all men. It shouldn't be all women. But you need both. You need both sexes talking about the problems, identifying the problems and the solutions. So I took a measure of comfort from that. It seemed to make some sense intuitively, but I want you to know I'm sensitive to that. And I want to hear from, particularly from the women in the audience about their experiences as we move forward. The second is, and I've already started this, I'm going to speak in very binary terms. I've structured this presentation so that it is binary in terms, it really focuses on cisgendered women. But I want to acknowledge that, there are LGBTQ issues as well, that all of this applies to, and that I don't want it to just be a footnote. I mean, it needs to be its own separate presentation. But as we move forward, that's not the way the structure of the program, or at least the presentation, is going to work. Some 20 years ago, I was involved in a major antitrust case. It was a bet the company life kind of case. And we brought in outside counsel to try the case. Woman. Only at the time, only two-time AUSA of the Year award winner, handpicked for the McVeigh-Nichols trial team, the finest trial lawyer I have seen or worked with. As part of the presentation, or as part of the preparation for the trial, we did what is called a clopening. So it's a combination of an opening, a presentation of evidence, and your closing. Brought in an international jury consultant, brought in 40 Utahns, having done all the statistical rigmarole to make sure they were representative of the juries we were going to have, and had them emotionally respond to the presentations, and then had 3 separate juries impaneled, and they were mic'd. As I listened, 2 comments, just enormous takeaways from that presentation, or from that listening experience, were, 1, listening to a juror in one of the juror panels describe this person who was immaculately and perfectly attired, and talking about her attire, but describing her as, in really offensive terms, as looking as if she were a streetwalker in New York. Nothing about the man. In another panel, describing her as if she had come from Hilldale. The complete polar opposite. Again, nothing about the man. It was eye-opening for me. It brought home for me in the most real way how much harder it is to be a woman in the courtroom in Utah. This is, as I said at the outset, this was the most professional, excellent trial attorney that I have worked with. But again, rather than focusing on skills, right, prospective jurors or people that would have been prospective jurors, those are the nature of the comments that they had to make rather than focusing on the case. Let me give you a roadmap of what I want to do. I'm going to start off with a video by Professor Jerry Kang, a TED Talk. Professor Kang is an expert. He's a law professor at UCLA that speaks specifically about these issues. And then I want to come back and I want to dig a little deeper into the war story that I just talked about and some of the experiences. Then let's talk about other aspects about how gender bias affects women in the legal profession. And I want to wrap up by addressing some strategies for how we can all of us can work to make it better.
So I'm going to start with an impolite question. Do you discriminate on the basis of race, gender, sexual orientation? I mean, if you were the identical TED Talk, but coming from a white guy, would you like it better? Of course not. Why would you do that? We all remember the dream. We remember what Martin Luther King Jr. taught us, right? He said we're supposed to judge people by the content of character, not the color of skin. You judge people only on the merits and nothing else. We're colorblind. But are you so sure? So it turns out actually some people actually are literally colorblind, so they can't see that tile A is much darker than tile B, but most of us actually can see that. But it's actually an illusion. Just like a smartphone camera does autofocus and autocorrect, it turns out our brains do the same thing constantly. And when we do so, we usually get things right, but sometimes the shadows and the compensation for actual contrast effects gets things wrong. It's this understanding that maybe our brains are like our powerful smartphone cameras that can actually tell us a lot about how things actually work. So think about it. The real world confronts you at a brutal pace in real time. You can't but engage in automatic processing. So when I came out on the stage, what did your brains do? You auto-focused on my face, you did some face recognition, and you immediately hashtagged me with multiple categories: male, middle-aged, professional, Asian. And then you stored that data in a mental cloud that you keep up here with all the other things that you have stored and hashtagged as Asian over the course of your entire lives. Now, a social psychologist would describe that mental cloud in terms of attitudes and stereotypes. Attitudes are like gut feelings, emotional valences of positive versus negative, like versus dislike, hot versus not, thumbs up versus thumbs down. By contrast, stereotypes are like traits that you associate with the category. So you already know I'm a professional, I'm a law professor. Once you put me into the category of Asian, you might be thinking, more likely than not that he got a perfect score on his math SAT. I'm Asian. More likely than not that I have a second-degree black belt in some ancient East Asian martial art. More likely than not that I was raised by a tiger mom who forced me to practice, not cello, but violin 6 hours a day, such as I performed at Carnegie Hall at the age of 16. 2 out of those 3 are actually true. Decades of research have told us that actually these attitudes and these stereotypes influence how you see me and how you behave. So if I want to know whether you discriminate, I actually have to get access to that mental cloud. I have to know what the junk is inside your head. Now, one way to do that is for me to just sidle up to you and ask, like, on average, sir, are African Americans more violent and criminal than white folks? On average, ma'am, do you think that women just aren't as good as men in engineering and science, whether they be 12-year-olds or 40-year-olds? On average, do you think Asians are really good at technically copying things, but lack the creativity that we really so desperately desire in a context such as this? When I ask these further impolite questions, I run into 2 veils. First, even if you have attitudes and stereotypes that you're aware of, you're not going to tell me what you really think, especially when the cameras are rolling. Like, how many beers must you have drunk before noon before you actually tell me what you think? More disturbing is that you might have implicit biases, mental associations that you're not even aware of, these filters that come from culture day in and day out. And if you're not even aware of them, you're not able to self-report even to yourselves, much less others. And there's decades, again, of social psychological research that says, in a weird way, our brains are such ridiculously complex machines that we can't just introspect and figure out what's really going on. As Timothy Wilton says, we are strangers to ourselves. So how then do we measure these implicit biases that we might not even be aware of? Do we put you under hypnosis? Do we put you under an fMRI and take brain scans? What about something simpler, like playing a video game? In order to understand, I need you to participate. The rules are very, very easy. All you have to do is run down columns 1, 2, and 3, and as quickly as possible, ignore the letters, shout out the colors. So for column number 1, you would say green, red, purple, green. I need all of you to participate. Ready, set, go. Green, red, purple, green. It's a TED audience. I assumed it would be a little bit better. Okay, second time. Here we go. Ignore the letters. Focus only on the colors. Ready, set, go. Oh, yeah, you're screaming. So third time should be the charm. Now, I want you to focus only on the colors. Be blind to the letters as if Martin Luther King Jr. implored you to do it. Ready, set, go. All right. It's like being stuck in molasses in a winter January, right? So now you get it. Now you see it. The whole point is that any two concepts that are tightly associated in our brains, we can actually pair together very quickly. So when you see the word RED and the color red, we can sort them very quickly together. By contrast, when you see the word RED and the color green, we hesitate. It's like our CPUs are thrashing about trying to get the right answer. We're not stupid. We got admitted as participants in the TED Talk. Like, we should be doing this faster, but it takes a little bit longer. But that's the insight, right? That you could use the speed of sorting as a signal for how tight things are mentally associated in this cloud that we don't have access to. That is the underlying logic of the implicit association test invented by Tony Greenwald. And you sit in front of a computer and play essentially a video game. You're flashed, for example, on the standard black-white attitudinal IAT, pictures of white folks, white men, hit a key with your left hand. If you see a picture of a black man, hit a key with your right hand. We could do that. It's actually easy. When you see sometimes good words like beauty and joy, hit a key with your left hand. By contrast, when you see words like filth and sick, bad words, hit a key with your right hand. We can follow these instructions. Notice the actual arrangement. White faces and good words are on the same response key. Black faces and bad words are on the same response key. And we fly through that test. But because psychologists are devious people, sometimes randomized and counterbalanced, you get runs like this, where you get white faces and bad words on the same hand, and black faces and good words on the same hand. And then we hesitate, we stutter, we make a few more errors, we go a little bit more slowly. It's that delta in time that by definition is deemed to be a measure of your bias that you could measure, and it might be only 300 milliseconds. It might only be 200 milliseconds. But that's the test that was created. Now, if this test is just nonsense, whether you're left-handed or right-handed, whether you grew up playing Nintendo versus Xbox, what would you see if you gave this test to a lot of people? Well, you would see random noise, like a coin flip, right? Half the people would sort good words with white faces faster, other time faster with black faces. It would just be 50-50. So think about what data has been collected. So you actually have this amazing site, Project Implicit, run by Brian Nozick, Majrin Banaji, and Tony Greenwald, both professors Banaji and Greenwald I've had the great pleasure of co-authoring with. They've collected millions of IAT scores, and here's what we see. It's not 50-50. 80% of us associate good words faster with pictures of young people versus old people. 68% white over black. 68% straight over gay. 69% thin over fat. 76% abled over disabled, and 72% of us are faster to sort pictures of weapons with black male faces versus white male faces. It's not random. Moreover, these implicit biases seem to be strong. You could measure people's explicit biases. You go up there and you ask them survey questions, and they can answer anonymously. When they do, they show some preference in the ways that you would predict of young over old, white over black, and so on. But when you look at the implicit biases, actually expressed in the same standard statistical units, you see implicit biases as being stronger. It's as if explicitly we can hear the wisdom of Martin Luther King, but implicitly, not so much. We want to be colorblind, but maybe Nietzsche was right. There is no immaculate perception. But do milliseconds really matter, as my friend Dolly Chuk has asked? Like, I've shown you that there's all this evidence about time, 300 milliseconds, but we don't really care about time. We care about behavior. Does behavior change as a function of this? This is precisely what we wanted to ask and answer. So, for example, if you had to put on headphones and listen to a lawyer's cross-examination, would you judge the lawyer differently as a function of whether you thought the lawyer was white versus Asian? Of course not. We're the model minority, right? And we all remember the dream. But that's what we wanted to ask and answer. So my colleagues, Nilanjana Dasgupta, Kumar Yogiswaran, as well as Gary Blasey, actually brought in a lot of people outside of UCLA, mostly white. We, of course, measure their explicit bias. So we give them survey questions. I ask them, on average, right, how eloquent do you think the white American litigator is? Eloquent, assertive, persuasive. We ask the exact same questions about Asian American litigators. Guess what the results are? Surprise, surprise, no average difference. We all remember the dream. But we don't want to stop there. We also want to measure their implicit biases. And it turns out, even though there's no average difference in explicit survey results, there is a difference in speed. We're faster to sort white faces with litigator words than Asian faces with litigator words. So we see some difference. Of course, all that we really care about is actual behavior. They heard these cross-examinations. They were tricked into thinking that one was done by an Asian person, one was done by a white person. The way we tricked them was just to flash a 5-second picture of the Asian attorney or the white attorney and changing the last name on the transcript that they read along with. The results were really interesting. Some good news and bad news. So the good news is that the implicit bias, this kind of little reaction time, didn't seem to have an impact on how they evaluated the Asian attorney. But when it came to the white attorney, it did have an impact. The higher the bias, the higher the evaluations. So to give you some concrete sense, imagine someone like Philip who has zero implicit bias. This is what he would have given the white attorney as a score on a 7-point scale on competence, likability, hireability. But imagine someone else like Matthew, who's in the 93rd percentile of bias. He would have given these scores much higher on a 7-point scale. Even if Matthew has no explicit bias, his implicit bias, as measured by this silly little video game, implicitly moved him. He was moved by what I call the rightness of whiteness. There's an impact. Our study emphasizes and gives more evidence to the belief that these implicit biases actually alter our behavior. And scientists have said and found that implicit biases could influence the way that we get called back for resumes, how awkward my body language is to you, whether we hire men over women in the laboratory, whether we cut minority student budgets or not, how doctors actually recommend treatments for heart attacks, the speed of shooting blacks versus whites in a video simulation, and even cops' use of force out in the field as correlated with an implicit stereotype of African Americans and of all things apes. This forces us, the mind sciences forces us to rethink. We thought we were blessed with immaculate perception, but it turns out we're infected with implicit bias. We thought the problem was explicit racism only in the past, but it turns out there's subtle discrimination going on right now. We thought it was enough to teach our kids don't be a hater without actually warning them about parochially loving only themselves. We thought it's not my fault, when the truth is we're the problem. What to do? Unfortunately, my time is up, so you're going to have to wait for my next TED Talk. All I can say is the following. There's great, interesting scientific evidence that if you're exposed to countertypical exemplars, your biases actually decrease at least temporarily. So no matter what your Asian baggage might have been in your head, it might be that by the course of this talk, I changed them along the way. More important is to recognize that there is no immaculate perception. And that recognition is the next critical step on our long climb up the mountaintop to the promised land toward his dream. Thank you.
So Professor Kang is not just talking about gender bias, obviously. He's talking broadly about explicit versus implicit biases. And that's the first takeaway that I wanted us to take from this video. Right? There are different forms of biases. The second is implicit bias is real. It matters. The third is awareness of all forms of bias is progress. So let's talk for a minute just about explicit or implicit bias, right? Implicitly, the words that I heard from those potential jurors, I think those are good examples of implicit bias. They weren't thinking about it. It's not that they were necessarily, discriminating against women, but these kinds of conversations came up. Another example is I used to have, when I was running the trials, I'd have the lawyers talk to the jurors afterwards. And in one particular event, I decided to do it in the courtroom. Had a female defense lawyer and a male prosecutor in that particular case, and invited the jurors to comment. One of the jurors, female on the jury, her focus was on the defense lawyer's, the female's disheveled hair. Right? Again, nothing about performance, nothing about the substance, but only about appearance. Truly implicit bias. Right? Explicitly, I put up some examples, but as Professor Kang said, explicit bias is easy to identify if they're going to be honest with us. Explicit bias is easy to measure, again, if they're going to be honest with us. Implicit bias, much more difficult. Implicit bias takes a lot of different forms, and we're not going to break down the various forms. Implicit bias is harder to understand, and it's harder to overcome, I would argue. So let's talk a little bit more about the war story, right? In a landmark 2001 report on sexism in the courtroom, Deborah Brody, a Stanford law professor, wrote that women in the courtroom face what she described as a double standard and a double bind. Women, she wrote, must avoid being seen as too soft or too strident, too aggressive or not aggressive enough. Back to the war story. One of the things that we did is the jurors, these 40 individuals, had to emotionally react to every statement that was being made, that I was making, or that my colleague was making as we spoke. Register their emotional reaction to it. And in the back room, right, we graphed it. We could graph it by religion, age, gender, you name it, as we were trying to identify who our model juror would be for this particular trial. Right? Every time I got loud and aggressive, my scores went up. Every time she got loud and aggressive, her scores went down. Social science research bears this out. It's demonstrated that when female attorneys show emotions like indignation, impatience, or anger, juries may see them as shrill, irrational, and unpleasant. And the same emotions, when expressed by men, are interpreted as appropriate to the circumstance of a case. Again, listening into the jurors afterwards with the mics bore it out for me in real time, right? So let me stop here before we move on and see if there are any questions or comments. All right. Look, it's not just about gender bias in the courtroom. Right? Bias and discrimination take place in the legal workplace. In 2020, women respondents overwhelmingly reported that discrimination was based on sex. May also indicated discrimination based on marital status, caretaker status, age, religion, etc. But overall, we observed an increase in reported experience of sex discrimination by women lawyers in every employment type. This came from the 2020 study of gender and racial bias, just published by the Utah Women Lawyers of Utah. In government in 2020 or 2010, 11% of women attorneys reported being subjected to sexual discrimination in the workplace. In 2020, the number stood at 25%. Now look, maybe that's as a result of increased reporting, maybe it isn't. Doesn't matter. What we do know is that it's not just discrimination and gender bias that's taking place in the courtroom, right? It's taking place in our profession. We're getting better, right? The Bob's message, we are getting better. Women now make up a majority of the students in our law schools across the United States. This is the 2020 graphic. Utah is a little below 50%, but we're all pretty close, up to, I think, California is the highest, I think at 57%. But on average, it's about 52% across the country. That's great. That's real progress. But women still occupy positions of power in the law in overwhelmingly disproportionate and small numbers. Right? We know women are still making up a greater percentage of lawyers as well. Right? There's a huge increase, up to 38% now, of women in the law. Not so much in Utah. So again, back to the 2020 study of gender and racial bias in Utah. While 38% of the national lawyer population is female, women make up 23% of the lawyers here in Utah. Anecdotally, right, when I go and we do all the swearing in ceremonies, I know that it's about 50% of the population at the law schools that's female. Even by the time I'm doing the graduation ceremony, as I'm counting down and just doing it, the statistical comparison, it's about 1 in 3 by that point in time. As I said, though, right, it's not just while we are doing a great job of improving the numbers, and they're going to continue to improve, there's still this disproportionately small number of women in the law in positions of power. So let's think about first the law students, right? While we have a majority of the students that are female, less than 40% of the professors are female. I've talked to some of my colleagues again at the law school, and I understand also that it plays out in different ways. It plays out in the way that the students interact with the professors. Right? Male students are more likely to be aggressive and challenge female professors than the opposite. It also shows up when we're talking about the bench. According to the Gavel Project, state courts handle more than 90% of the legal business in America, but fewer than 1/3 of all state judges are women. Right? I experienced this myself. I encourage people to apply for the bench. And it is not an exaggeration to say, for every 1 man that I encourage to apply, I need to encourage 9 women to apply to get an equal number of applicants. Why is that? Help me out. Give me a theory. Yeah. Again, social science indicates that men look at the qualifications necessary, and if they're meeting about 2/3 or so of those qualifications, they believe that they're worthy of making the application. Women, not so much, right? 90% or so. All right. So it's not, I don't think it's much of a debate about whether or not there is an issue, right? Gender bias in the courtroom, I am sure that both males and females in this room have experienced it. No question that you've all seen it or we've been party to it, where females, where women have been treated less fairly than they should have been, or based on things that aren't specific to performance. The examples that I gave it, and that it's pernicious, and that it is kind of infected the entire system, that it continues. But we can do something about it. And the first thing we can do, as Professor King pointed out, is just be aware of our implicit biases, right? Take stock. Think about our responses. Kind of just, check our thinking at the door and understand where we can be better, that they exist, right? And that we can improve. But there are other more concrete strategies. And I'm borrowing entirely now, by the way, from the best practices outlined by the Utah Women Lawyers Study. So how do we become a bias disruptor? Now that we're aware of our implicit biases, now that we're aware that others may also have implicit biases, what can we do to improve? I'm going to offer you a number of scenarios that were outlined by the study. Scenario number 1, disrupting agency penalties. Your colleague, Maria, is frequently interrupted by men when she speaks in meetings, and she's accused of being too passionate or assertive about her ideas. What are some bias interruption strategies? Somebody be brave. Give me an idea. Yes. Spot on, right? So with one caveat, maybe never interrupt to begin with. But if you do, wait until the speaker. So if you need clarification, wait until the speaker is finished. But as Bob said, if not, right, then excuse me. Then ask the interrupter to wait, right? I mean, kind of challenge the interrupter and tell them to wait until the colleague's done speaking. Or redirect the discussion. Redirect it to Maria's performance and the substance of her comments. One other thing is to set up decision-making by consensus. I found that to be interesting. Right? That apparently decision-making by consensus, so that all members of the audience or of the team feel empowered to speak, is also a particularly important bias disruption strategy. Scenario number 2, disrupting motherhood bias. So a colleague suggests that not giving a high-quality opportunity to your colleague, Maya, because she recently had a baby and may not want to bear the extra responsibility. Again, somebody give me some bias interruption strategies, please. Yeah, so, and for the record, I believe that these scenarios came from actual experiences. Sure. So the comment was that this situation has actually happened. The commenter at another agency. And I think that the solution or the bias disrupting strategy in that case was to address it with the person who was subject to that and seek their input in how to deal with the particular situation. Right? Yeah. So again, I would say that's close to spot on. Right? You need to talk to your colleague and ask her what her preference is. Right? don't imagine that you know what the individual's preference is based upon their gender, right? Have a discussion with them, right? Remind your colleagues who may have made that statement that Maya is perfectly competent and committed, and she's earned the promotion, right? And the opportunity, right? And then ensure that Maya and others, all colleagues, right, receive the committee assignments, the other assignments, whatever it might be, just irrespective of their family status. I think most of this is kind of 101 behavior for all of us. But I think it's good to hear it. I think it's good to think about it. And because as you pointed out, these items come up, and they come up in the real world. Scenario number 3, disrupting social and network bias. Your colleagues plan a meeting, lunch or dinner, golf ski outing, whatever, but don't invite any female colleagues. What do? What do you do? Yeah, right. So what other possible strategies can you use? What do you do if you point it out to them and nothing changes? What happens? So the comment was pointed out, by the way, for the audience that's not here, point out to your colleagues that this is happening. All right, you've pointed it out, but the event is still going forward. What's your response? Don't go. Don't participate, right? If female colleagues are being excluded and not welcome, right? Don't be a part of the event. So what else can you do? Invite your colleagues to participate, obviously, in any and all work-related functions, including functions with clients, customers, and other colleagues. Right? And if the event is not inclusive, suggest another type of event. So you can still do it, but an event in which everybody is welcome. And express a desire, as you pointed out, that they be invited. All right, scenario number 4, disrupting subjective assessment bias. When evaluating job candidates, your colleague Elizabeth questions whether Jasmine, one of the only women of color applicants, is a good fit for the organization. Again, what are some positive ways of dealing with this form of bias? All right, 1, let Elizabeth know that you think Jasmine is an excellent colleague and candidate, and ask her which specific criteria required for the job are lacking in Jasmine's record. Ensure that the hiring committee includes women and men and people of color. Ask Elizabeth and other members of the committee how your organization needs to change so that excellent candidates like Jasmine could be a good fit. And encourage Elizabeth to use only objective criteria included in the job advertisement and to apply those criteria to all candidates, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, etc. Scenario number 5, disrupting distancing bias. Your colleague Jim avoids close mentoring or sponsorship relationships with women as to protect them and himself from gossip. This happened to anyone? So the comment from the audience is an individual who's encountered this precise scenario, right? And not been invited to functions, work functions, other opportunities because the male colleague was uncomfortable. I have to tell you, this one in particular, as I've spoken on this topic, women, and I would say, and it really has, I mean, it's not unique to private practice, but I've heard it over and over again in that context, right? So imagine you need to go on a lengthy deposition trip to do discovery, right? You feel uncomfortable. So you think, you know, your spouse may care, or you should invite somebody of the same sex, whatever it happens to be. But it seems to be a regular theme. Do you have any suggestions for how to deal with it? Right. So if I could summarize for the audience at home, it's to help, again, I think it's awareness is the point. Help men become aware of what's going on, how it affects you, how it affects your career, and that this really is just about the work, right? And that you need these opportunities. And I think that that's right. You need to encourage all of your peers, male and female alike, right, to include you in these opportunities. We're talking about putting women in positions of power in the law, not just in the law, in other positions, in other professions. And you can't get there as easily, at least you can, but not as easily, right, if you're excluded from meaningful work opportunities. It's really difficult, right? So frequently discuss the benefits of mentorship, right, for women and for your own career, and how valuable it can be. Again, it goes to the point of understanding and assessing, being aware of your bias and its impact on others. Let the individual know, right, that avoiding women colleagues is harmful to their advancement and violates your organization's sense of equity. Suggest specific promising candidates to Jim, the male in this example, and offer to facilitate an introduction for the purpose of improving his mentorship and sponsorship of those individuals. All right. Scenario number 6, disrupting hostile workplace bias. Your colleague Bill makes a racist joke about immigrants. Your colleague Maria asks him to avoid such humor, and Bill accuses her of being too serious or lacking a sense of humor. What do you do? One, don't wait for the women, for the people of color to correct this type of behavior. Be the first to speak out about it and against it. Let Bill know that you're uncomfortable with that type of racist or sexual humor and those anecdotes. Second, let Bill know that maintaining a respectful atmosphere in the workplace has nothing to do with one's sense of humor. Third, follow up with Maria privately to make sure that she's okay with the strategies together about and how you will address such incidents in the future. This relates back to your comment at the very beginning about being inclusive. Now, I think you want to be very careful that you're not putting that person in the bind, right? That you're bringing them in and collaborating, but not putting them in a really uncomfortable position and making things more difficult, right? So it's tricky. And it's something that you just need to think through to make sure that you're addressing the problem in the right way. Scenario number 7, and the last of the scenarios, disrupting the lack of fit bias. You arrive in court with your co-counsel. Gabrielle, an opposing counsel mistakes her for your paralegal or clerk. What do you do? Okay. Anything else? Because you're right, obviously. So first of all, how many times has this happened? To whom has this happened, male or female, in the audience? Right? I see it all the time. Interestingly, I was just out with some law students, right? A male and a female. And we were talking about law school, and a friend came over, a male, and immediately assumed that the law student, would be the male and not the female. It's even worse when you walk into the courtroom. The first thing you can do, right, though, is just preempt it. Right? Introduce them as your colleague or as your co-counsel. And again, don't wait for Gabrielle to speak up and correct the error. You do it, right? Let opposing counsel know that Gabrielle is a talented and well-valued member of the legal team. Third, ask opposing counsel why they assumed that Gabrielle was not co-counsel. And then, maybe most importantly, let Gabrielle take the lead in ways that demonstrate her talent and quality and capabilities. Right? These are just some of the scenarios in which we face gender bias in the profession, in the courtroom. Right? But I thought they were excellent examples from the 2020 study, and I would commend the 2020 study that was conducted by the Women Lawyers of Utah for all of you. Very easy to access, very easy to digest. All right, what's the C? What can we do? Right? So, culture change. Two of several examples from the Women Lawyers of Utah report. One, be an ally. Listen, build relationships, and mentor. Right? And two, support appropriate policy changes. Two examples that the report gave of the latter are A, inclusive recruitment strategies, and B, flexible work hours. I think about those recruitment strategies. It's a little bit related to what I was talking about in terms of trying to increase the number of women on the bench, right? Is you make sure that you have qualified minorities, females in your pool, as well as in the evaluation process, sitting on the other side. Let's stop here for questions. And observations, maybe more importantly, and I really want to hear from some of the women in the audience about experience that they have had in the courtroom. Yes, please. Yeah, so the question I think is what, help me, but what can, whether I've had the experience and what I've done, as well as what would you have other judges do, right? Yeah, so the answer to the first part is yes. And in fact, in the Judicial Code of Conduct, right, in the courtroom in particular, judges are required to correct that kind of behavior. And I've done it in various ways, depending on the level of the egregiousness. Anything from a little private, let's come up here and have a quick chat about this was said, right? To something out in the open in front of everyone in the courtroom. And in the particular case I'm thinking about were some particularly egregious comments about Native Americans. When you have a Native American happen to be sitting in the jury pool at the same time, it's just. But I think you have to call it out when you recognize it as a judge. Having said that, I will tell you, I think I've fallen short time after time after time after time. And it's even going through this process of preparing, this process of thinking about these speeches helps me understand, right? And it goes back to the awareness again of how often this happens and gives me some good ideas, some good examples of how, other than just calling it out, might preempt it or might otherwise deal with the strategy. And that's what I would tell the other judges. I mean, this type of scenario role playing, bringing up real world examples and talking about constructive ways to deal with it, I think is really important. It goes back to Kang's point about, it's awareness in the first instance. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, Mike, hi. I have so many comments, but I'm just going to make one. I love the comment that you made about the fit and just kind of how that's an issue. And I want to just give a quick example to support what you were saying. So I was on a committee picking somebody for the Utah Law School, and there were two candidates, a man and a woman. And in discussing, I was on the committee, and in discussing their various traits, somebody in the room said, I don't know about the woman. She just a little bit casual, and she doesn't have the right personality or something like that. She seems too, kind of, I don't even know the word they said, but, casual or unprofessional or something they said. And then other people were like, yeah, and we're commenting about how the man was like kind of fit the role more. He would be better for investors of the law school, with the board of trustees, with students, with faculty, that kind of thing. And I kind of pushed back because I was thinking, well, okay, this looks a little bit like implicit bias to me. And so I said, well, what is it? What did she do that was maybe viewed by you as unprofessional? And honestly, nobody could say anything. I'm like, did she flirt with a student in an interview? Did she say bad language? Did she, what was it? And really all they could come up with was, well, she just laughs a little bit loudly. And I'm like, okay, not a problem, right? That's not, it just seemed very clear to me. And then I said, this looks a lot more like implicit bias. And then a few other people in the room kind of supported it. And then that was done. And so I do think if there are voices and we start to see those little things, because you wouldn't normally see that in an interview. You'd say, well, yeah, okay, we don't like her personality, but personality can be closely linked with fit, which closely is linked with implicit bias. So I love that point. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the comment, because it feels to me like that was, this moment, this war story that I've described was kind of a watershed moment for me, right? And a real inflection point about understanding how much more difficult it is to be a woman. I would say to you in that context, I doubt very much if you were to ask those men that were involved in that they actually think they have an explicit bias, right?
So I think we're just as bad as men are.
And a fair point to that's fair. And that's a good example. I need to check myself, right? I made an improper assumption. It is true, for example, the woman with the disheveled hair, right? Again, it is true that it happens for both men and women harbor implicit biases, and culture has caused this so that even if you're a member of the same sex, you still have or may have, perhaps not the same percentage, implicit biases that you need to check. Right? We're sensitized that way, and we need to be aware of it. Right? You need to call it out. You need to correct it. Right? So it wasn't just enough to have women on the committee. Right? It wasn't just enough to have women on the pool, but awareness of implicit bias and its perniciousness was important. Yes, in the back.
So I'm in rural Utah, where the female attorney is basically somewhat non-existent, right? For my area, I see a lot of gender bias across our county positions. And I'm just wondering about your advice on how we could address that culture. So basically, there are female and male positions across county government, essentially, right? So the attorneys are male, the legal assistants are female, the justice court judges are male. In general, the law clerks are female. The county clerk is a female position. Her staff are all female. County commissioners are male. The road department is male, and all the guys out on the big heavy machinery are male. The county sheriff is male, and all the cops are male. It's to the sheriff's, for him, he specifically will hire positions and only allow females to apply because he has to have some female, specifically in the jail, to do work. So to his credit, he does that. He says, if you're male, don't apply for this position, right? You're not eligible. And we felt like that we can legally justify that. My question is, yes, we reach out and encourage females to apply for those typically male positions, that this culture is pretty strict about that. Should I further try to disrupt that culture by encouraging males to apply for the female positions? The quote unquote female positions?
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, as I've thought about, interestingly, that kind of question, and I think it's a pretty good debate, about whether is it really reverse discrimination that you're trying to cure in that setting, or is there something unique about the fact that the underrepresented population isn't getting the opportunities, and by equating the two, are you really minimizing, right, that fact? So the short answer is I don't know the answer to your particular question, right? But I think about this. It's, there's the debate that happened recently with Governor Cox's comments. I mean, it's very similar to me in what you're talking about. Does that make sense? I'm not sure what the answer is. I think I know what I would do. I think personally, I think that it would minimize gender bias if you just equate the two and say that they're equal. But I can easily see that others may not feel the same way about that in their real world experiences. So I don't know that I would do that, but I would think about it. I would consult with people that really are deep thinkers in the particular area before I reached any final conclusions for me personally. So listen, my time is up. I very much appreciate being here. As I said, right, it's been a long time for all of us. This is so nice to be in a room with people again. Several of you that I know that have appeared in front of me. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. And I hope that this is just a little step forward in increasing awareness to make it easier to be a woman in the courtroom, to be a woman in the legal profession, and a woman in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justice Simonis. So we're going to take a break and we will begin at 9:45.